This is a special presentation of the Gaming News Canada show with Steve McAllister.
Hello again and welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show. And yes, I'm your host, Steve McAllister. With apologies to Charles Dickens, these are the best of times when it comes to women's sports. On Tuesday night at BMO Field in Toronto, a day before we record this podcast, a crowd of almost 19,000 watched Canada and Mexico play to a 1-1 draw in the finale of a two-game women's friendly soccer series. Last month, the organizers of the new Canadian Women's Soccer League unveiled its new name, the Northern Super League, as it continues to prepare for its inaugural season in 2025. The Professional Women's Hockey League just concluded its inaugural campaign with PWHL Minnesota defeating PWHL Boston in a championship series that needed a fifth and deciding game. The WNBA has received more coverage than ever before, thanks in large part to the Caitlin Clark bump. And before hitting a bump at last week's Women's U.S. Open, Nelly Korda had been on a record run with 6 wins and 7 events on the LPGA Tour. And as we record this podcast on Wednesday afternoon, just hours after the Women's Tennis Association introduced former NBA G League Chief Operating Officer Portia Archer as its new Chief Executive Officer. It's also a period of growth, it would appear, when it comes to women betting on sports. Back in February, BetMGM announced more than 51% more women used its sportsbook to bet on this year's Super Bowl over the NFL's 2023 title tilt. To talk more about all of this, we welcome to the podcast the man in charge of BetMGM's Canadian business, Scott Woodgate, and the company's public relations manager, Media Insights, John Ewing. Scott, great to get you. I think it's back on the show, though part of me is wondering is this your maiden appearance on the Gaming News Canada show?
Long-time listener, first-time caller, yes. I think this is the first appearance here, Steve.
Well, long overdue. I'm glad we were finally able to wrestle you down to the floor and get you to join us.
Happy to be here.
And John, just we had a chance to meet off camera a few years ago, and really appreciate having the guy who can best dig in the numbers join us on the podcast as well.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to join you.
Hey, John, let's start with you, and let's just dig into the data. And given what I spoke about a few years ago, and I believe BetMGM put out some data either in March or April around the time of Women's March Madness with just the increase. And this is something I know that BetMGM has paid close attention to, I think probably over the last 18 months where you're obviously you are seeing that there's a bump when it comes to betting on women's sports, and that might not just be among women.
Yeah, you're right. This has been a trend we've noticed for a while now, but we really saw an increase beginning of this year or during the football season leading into March Madness. And a couple of things drive that, right? There's the continued expansion of legalized sports betting. So as more people have an opportunity to wager on games, they're open to wagering on women's sports as well. You then have more women's sports being broadcast or streamed. So a bettor is more likely to wager on a game if they can watch it. And then, of course, you have the Taylor Swift and Caitlin Clark effect, right? Star power brings more eyeballs, which then in turn brings more interest to the sport.
Hey, Scott, we'll maybe get into this a little bit later. And before I get back to John, I think, the one obstacle that there has been with women's sports is I think to John's point, the lack of exposure of women's sports on mainstream television or streaming now. And then I think part of it from a sports betting operator's perspective has been just a lack of data. And I think that's not just with women's sports. We've seen that, and we've talked to Nick Sulsky about this in the past with curling, where it's tough for a sports book to offer odds and to offer product to customers when there's not that data available. But it seems that that's slowly changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really exciting time. I feel we're really at the start of something, and a lot of it starts with capturing the attention of fans. And you mentioned the media coverage, and I know that's the world that both you and I come to gaming from before our current roles. But watching the boost in coverage across the board on all distribution channels is just remarkable in such a short period of time. I was watching SportsCenter last night, and the lead. I'm in New York today, and the lead was not the Yankees. The lead were highlights from the Women's College World Series game between Florida and Oklahoma with Scott Van Pelt. So, I think that's really indicative of the audience and the way the audience is changing. And I think, a lot of the success is capturing the attention of fans. And it demands a unique mix. And that's probably stars and rivalries, things that are traditional drivers in sports, but also, sprinkled in a little controversy, and it all increases the share of voice. And I think it just becomes a bigger conversation. I think it's really important and it's really healthy.
And John, it really feels like everything goes hand in hand, right? You get, as you have more attendance in arenas, you have more television viewers, that's probably going to translate to more bettors as well.
Yeah, you're right. And some just cold hard numbers here around the increase in betting on women sports and betting by women. If you just go back to the Super Bowl, right? Again, Taylor Swift, she brought a bunch of attention to the NFL. We saw a 51% increase in the number of women wagering on the game this year versus last year. And then that carried over to the NCAA tournament with Caitlin Clark. The championship game, the Final Four, and the Elite Eight were the three most bet games in women's sports history at BetMGM. So Caitlin Clark was just, took it to a whole next level, right, of interest. She even had bettors wanting to just wager on all of her props as well. And she was not just being the most bet woman, she was far exceeding that of interest from the men's side as well. She had 80% more bets on her props than Zach Edey, who was the star or one of the stars of the men's NCAA tournament.
Right. Hey, John, and I guess, again, if the three of us were chauvinists, we would look at the Super Bowl and say, okay, sure, women are interested in the Super Bowl because they can bet on the national anthem or the color of the Gatorade or how many songs are going to be performed during the halftime show. But I'm assuming that when you refer to Caitlin Clark and the interest in March Madness, it's women's sports fans are betting on Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, and they're as invested in what happens in the game as their male counterparts.
Exactly. I mean, in general, just like overall, we've seen a surge in betting on women's sports. And it's not just the women, it's the men too. And they both show similar interest. And again, Caitlin Clark plays like Steph Curry. She's out there crossing players over, shooting deep threes. These are all very exciting plays. And her props are the most bet in the NCAA tournament. They're the most bet since she's transitioned now to the WNBA, which has already seen record handle at BetMGM just in the first few weeks of the season.
Scott, I want to get into the whole Caitlin Clark phenomenon with you a little bit later from a sports media perspective, because it's really been a hot button issue, especially with the Kennedy Carter incident over the weekend. But the fact that John brings out that data, has that prompted BetMGM to maybe change some of its marketing strategy a bit and to do things that make BetMGM appeal more to women's sports bettors?
I think absolutely. There's more visibility on the product, if that's what you mean. It's certainly an immediate effect when that happens, and it's happening across the industry. I think about the user base is traditionally on the sports side is heavily male, and then perhaps more evenly split or diverse on the casino side. And I think you'll see a lot of crossover now where you may have not seen that before. So I think that's one of the other aspects of this.
Hey, John, I'm hoping I'm not forcing you to dig too deep in your Excel worksheets here, but when you look at other sports as well, I think the NHL, they've had data in the past that shows that there's a fairly large segment of women who watch NHL games or invest in the NHL. Like, what's the interest that you're maybe seeing in other professional sport leagues? And I think the one thing that gets overlooked, guys, too, is that I've been covering the industry for 3.5 years now, and sports like women's tennis and women's golf are very, very well established sports, and certainly have their stars. Although I think golf has had an interesting conundrum, I guess, with a lot of their stars in recent years have been from Asia, and Nelly Korda has probably been the first American golf star that we've seen for quite some time. But John, how are women betting with relation to other sports leagues?
I mean, just again, across the board, it's double-digit growth. No matter, pick the sport, it doesn't matter. But, how about just one narrative is, women are betting on sports that have women in it or are related to it. So the Super Bowl with the Chiefs, you had Taylor Swift. The NCAA tournament and WNBA, you had Caitlin Clark. But something, kind of completely separate from that, how about this year's Masters tournament? We saw 161% increase in the number of women betting on the tournament. And there's no direct, Taylor Swift, Caitlin Clark effect there. That's just bettors that have come in, have got to, enjoy wagering on football and basketball. And now, hey, here's the next big event. How about, it makes it a little more entertaining to have a rooting interest in some players.
And I think, sorry to jump in, Steve, I think part of it too is it comes back to the content and the availability of the content across, a lot of platforms. And when John talks about obviously those major tournaments on the male side, it's all available. But when you look at women's sports, those things are starting to become available now. And it's not just a live broadcast. It's the shoulder program, it's the highlight shows, it's the placement of those things. It's an amazing amount of growth, as I said at the start, in a short period of time. I think back to my former employer, DAZN, the streaming service, did a deal with the Women's Champions League in 2021. I think it ends in 2025. But immediate global reach for the women's game across around the world, and part of that business model suddenly places things behind a paywall in the streaming atmosphere. But in this instance, they made it free, and a lot of the games free, so they were able to be viewed without going behind a paywall. And I think that's an important thing as well. And it just requires patience. Nothing grows overnight. There's been great growth, but it doesn't happen overnight. I think you're seeing that obviously with some of the TV deals that are redone in North America across women's sports as well. Visibility.
Yeah, and I think with Scott, both you and I are extremely familiar with the changing sports media landscape, and there are other ways for women's sports to be covered now. There's lots of talented people out there doing blogs or posting social media video content. There are podcasts. So there are other ways beyond mainstream media outlets for people to cover league and to shine a light on the leagues and their star players.
Yeah, I think if you look to the UK and what soccer's done in the UK with the Lionesses and in the success after Euro 22 and the size of the audiences there, I think that's a pretty good barometer of what's happening in North America right now, at least the way I see it. If they can deliver on an audience, they can deliver to rights partners and sponsors, et cetera.
Hey, John, do you see any differences in the habits of female sports bettors versus men?
Not really. They're, everyone's pretty similar. When you look at a sports bettor, it's all right. So where do they live, right? I can probably guess who their favorite teams are to bet on. You see a lot of homerism, right, among bettors. It's the teams they love. It's the players they love. And then outside of that, you step back, it's who are the most popular players in each sport. LeBron James, no matter whether you love or hate him, you probably are going to wager on his props because he's always on TV. Again, it goes back to viewership and coverage and social media. So in general, men and women bet very similar. They love betting on their favorite teams. They love betting on, overs and cheering for points because that's always a fun way to watch a game, right?
Yeah. And Scott, you mentioned product earlier. Maybe ask both you and John about this. I mean, if we were having this conversation 5 years ago and on a night like tonight, BetMGM, your sports book, would be promoting, maybe Bryce Harper in a game. And if the NBA finals were starting tonight, you'd be promoting Luka Doncic, against the Celtics. And when we look at now, I mean, as to John's point earlier, I mean, Caitlin Clark probably has a prominent place in product when you log on your BetMGM Sportsbook app for a March Madness game or for a WNBA game on a Friday night. So even that dynamic shift from a product standpoint.
Yeah, again, visibility on a product is definitely shifted across the board. John could probably talk more about the American experience, but yeah, it's definitely shifted.
Yeah, just to jump in, you're 100% right, Steve. We have seen more, Fevers games, and during the NCAA tournament, more of the Iowa games are front and center on the landing page of the app, or when you go to betmgm.com. It's one of the first games because that's what, again, we're reflecting the interest in customers, right? We're not necessarily trying to drive them to these. They are telling us that's what they want. And so we're just reflecting that.
It really is so much like the media world, right, John? Where back in those days, Scott producing Dan Russell's radio show in Vancouver, if Caitlin Clark's the story of the day, Scott's working his butt off trying to get Caitlin Clark or a coach or an agent or someone from the league on the show. And the same thing in my days working in the newspaper business, you can't do enough on Caitlin Clark. So it is an interesting tie-in between Scott, our old worlds, and the world we both operate in today with John.
There are some amazing similarities to a sports network editorial meeting and the visibility of what is catching on in the betting world.
Closely Sorry, Scott. Our trading team works the same way. Every game has a standard set of odds that are going to be available, right? Spreads, totals, money lines. Player props would include, point totals, rebounds, if you're looking at basketball. But, for Caitlin Clark, for those NCAA tournament games, the trading team is trying to go the next step. What are maybe more interesting dynamic props that we can offer that just, again, reflect the interest in the sport? So you're right, Steve. It's very, very similar to media in that way.
Hey, Scott, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do, we see the pretty much positive response to the PWHL this year. And I think there's probably been a bit of a dipping of the toes in the water as it relates to sportsbook operators. And I know there are some regulatory hurdles as well. Minnesota, for example, doesn't have legal sports betting right now. But just your thoughts on where the PWHL kind of fits in with your business.
I think the coverage in Canada has been great. I think the way, from a broadcast point of view, it's been integrated in the coverage and highlights and in Hockey Night in Canada is something that is really new territory. And again, it's back to the remarkable growth. Players are celebrities, which is a phenomenal thing to think about, not only currently, but what the future holds. I mean, the goal of the league, initially, the stated goal was to be a sustainable league, which is obviously, as you know, there's a long history of leagues and not being sustainable and having access to services and things like that. So I think, that element has been really remarkable to watch. From our perspective, we're constantly watching, as we just talked about, the pickup and what the public wants to see in our product, and we'll continue to do that as the league grows in popularity.
Hey, John, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
No, I just back what Scott said. As soon as, again, we reflect the interest in bettors, right? So as the league grows, as there's more interest from fans and bettors, then there's more availability from the sportsbook.
Hey, John, I do want to ask you, too. We've got, obviously, there's a lot of interest in the Stanley Cup Finals. The Edmonton Oilers have a chance to become, I think, Scott, 1993 is the last time a Canadian franchise lifted Lord Stanley's mug. Do you just have some numbers around the Oilers, the Oilers-Panthers series, John?
Yeah, in general, when you kind of look at the betting on, let's go to game one, right? It's pretty evenly split on who's going to win that game. Bettors don't have a strong opinion, except for in Ontario, where nearly 80% of moneyline bets are on the Oilers to win that game. So a little bit of love for a fellow Canadian team there. And then big picture from like the series perspective, the sportsbook would love to see this go 7 games, and they would really like it if the Panthers could lift the cup.
Hey Scott, I don't know. Does BetMGM get some credit for the Connor McDavid ambassadorship? Has that had a part to play what's going on here?
No, I don't think there's a connection between the two. I think Connor was well on his way to a Stanley Cup final before we came along in Canada.
Yeah. Hey Scott, it's funny. I was on Tom Maynek's show, The Sport Market, out in Vancouver last week, and he was asking me about if sports books were seeing a bit of a bump from the Oilers going on this Stanley Cup final run. Again, not to put you or John on the spot, but if has there been any kind of a bump from the Oilers, or has it helped with your NHL product, and maybe not just in Canada, but on the US side as well?
I'll let John answer that, but I'll just jump in and say, it's remarkable to have a Canadian team in the final. First of all, it's a great storyline. We almost had you can imagine, we almost had the Oilers and the Rangers in the final. I'm sure, from a New York perspective, they would have wanted that, but they didn't get it. So it's been great. The games are at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So I think that's helpful as well. So I think, we're going to see increased interest in this final over previous years.
Hey, John, and does the fact that McDavid, the best player, I think we'd all acknowledge in the world right now, the fact that McDavid's playing in the Stanley Cup final, is that as relevant as there being a superstar in the NBA final, or what you're seeing with Caitlin Clark right now in the WNBA?
Yeah, no, it is. It mirrors every other sport, right? McDavid is a superstar, and he has been one of the most bet players on his props to score a goal, to score the first goal, to go over his points, over his assists, and that's happening for Game 1. We anticipate that to be through the rest of the series as well. So, Scott, I'll take credit for it. Yeah, BetMGM helped him become a superstar. Sure.
Attaboy, John. That's the way to put on your PR hat. Hey, John. John, I also want to ask you about the Celtics Mavericks final too, because I think that's a pretty good final. The Celtics are a heritage franchise. That's got to be a boost for the league to have Boston playing for the league championship. But what's the impact from a sports betting perspective?
Yeah, this is a dream matchup, right? You have some of the biggest stars in the league. You got Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic. You got Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. You got the Celtics with all their history. So that's just going to attract a lot of attention. And what's really interesting is that before the finals, both of those teams were winners for us from a futures perspective, because you had teams like the Nuggets and the Timberwolves and OKC, the Thunder, getting a ton of support from bettors. But since the finals have been set, it's just been a wave of money on the Mavericks. Everyone likes Luka as an underdog to win Game 1, to win the series. So even though both teams were a winner, maybe by tip-off tomorrow, they might actually be a loser for us. So Celtics winning would definitely be a good outcome for BetMGM.
Hey guys, the last question on this topic, and I referenced it before we hit the record button on the podcast, was I think it's fairly accepted, or the strategy for a lot of operators is to get sports bettors in the door. Scott, I think this was the case when Ontario opened back in April 2022. Obviously, a lot of the advertising and marketing was focused on the sports betting product. That was getting people in the front door as sports bettors, and then hoping those people also become online gaming customers at some point too. Is there a bit of role reversal in terms of women sports bettors, where they're coming from the iGaming side and moving into sports betting, or is it pretty consistent with what I mentioned?
I think there are a lot of new female customers on the platform because of what's happening in women's sports right now, as we discussed. As I mentioned before, I think we have obviously a very healthy user base of female customers that are now betting on sports in general, and women's sports is a part of that. And some of those are coming from the casino side. So I think it's a healthy transition every way you look at it.
John, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and of course, it helps that BetMGM offers one of the widest range of iGaming opportunities, right? To attract, get people in that funnel, and a lot of new exclusive games like CSI, Star Trek, The Godfather, Ace Ventura. These are big brands that players are attracted to.
Hey, John, before I want to talk to Scott for a few minutes about Ontario, but before I do, just how much do the Olympics resonate? Like the Paris Olympics are less than 100 days away, and I'm just curious. I guess this will be our first Summer Olympics, I believe, Scott, since the Ontario market opened, or maybe the second. But how prominent are the Olympics with your customers?
People love it, right? You have basketball, which again, you have all the big players from around the world, soccer, as well as very popular, track and field, swimming, gymnastics. All of this is going to drive a lot of interest from bettors. And I think it's going to line up pretty well with timing, where it's going to be during the day, right? We've had Olympics where it happens in the middle of early morning hours, and no one can watch it in North America. But I think the timing is going to work out pretty well, and that'll be advantageous from a sportsbook perspective.
And really fills a void in that summer sports schedule as well, right?
Yeah, it's a good timing right before the NFL starts back up.
Hey, Scott, I want to talk. We're just over 2 years into the Ontario market now, and we've had a few guests on the show over the last couple of weeks, and have got their thoughts. And you'll remember, I think we had a conversation pretty early in the opening months of the market opening here, and kind of anticipated there were going to be a lot of operators. I don't know if either one of us foresaw almost 50 operators coming in the marketplace, but back then there was a lot of talk about, okay, well, which small fish are going to come in, last for a year, maybe 2 years, and then pull out. What kind of, how much consolidation is there going to be? And that really hasn't happened in the first 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an amazing 2 years, and I think part of that credit goes towards iGaming Ontario and the time they spent in their role of conduct and managing entity in Ontario to get a lot of it right. And so, yeah, I think the competitiveness has surprised a lot of people. We launched in April with a handful of operators, as you mentioned, compared to what there is today. Some of our competitors had been here for a while, and we started from scratch, obviously with the brand we have, but we didn't have a user base in Ontario. And it's just been a remarkable example of growth and learnings, from an industry perspective. I do think the other provinces are watching, obviously, very closely what's happening in Ontario and taking a lot of learnings from this, which is a good thing. Some things we've worked some kinks out, and I think the other provinces will benefit from that experience.
Is it fair? Would you agree with, seems to be the consensus from people I talk to, is that the market's really started to settle in and kind of find its footing. And we got through the AGCO with the new advertising standards that imposed at the end of February, but the market does seem to have been at a point now where it's maybe not fully matured, but it's certainly moving in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting market to be in. If you look at all the jurisdictions across North America, I'd say this is probably one of the most exciting to be in, which is pretty lucky to be involved in that. The growth is still there. The market is still growing, month to month, and so we're still enjoying that wave, and we will continue onwards and see where it goes. But like you said, it does feel like we've hit our stride a little bit as far as the market's concerned.
There are a lot of eyeballs on Alberta right now, and the provincial government's kind of given a blessing to look towards establishing some kind of a regulatory framework there. We don't know what the timeline is around that. I think there are at least, there's definitely one, if not two, panels around Alberta at the Canadian Gaming Summit in the middle of June, and I'm sure Alberta's a story that you've been following closely.
If you had a nickel for every time it was raised on this show, you'd be a wealthy man, I think. It's been a while, hasn't it? Yeah. Look, I mean, I think they benefit, again, the aforementioned growth in Ontario and infrastructure here is going to be a benefit to all provinces. And I think the first one is going to be Alberta. We're watching the situation extremely closely. We want to be competitive in Alberta. And, it's government in Alberta is just recently started the infrastructure it takes to regulate the market, which is obviously a massive step towards getting all the things that they need in place to make it a healthy market to regulate in, but also things like responsible gaming and some of the regulatory regimes that need to happen minute by minute to make a successful market.
Hey, Scott, just one last question on this. And, the industry is still taking a fair bit of criticism. I don't know if you had a chance to see the Globe Mail editorial, I think, on Tuesday, suggesting that the same types of restrictions should be put around sports betting advertising as there are around alcohol right now. And there's still a lot of talk about that the operators and the industry is not doing nearly enough around responsible gambling. And, we just had another scandal come up with Major League Baseball yesterday, and the whole industry seems to get lumped in together when these scandals happen. Like what would you is there a simple answer to give to some of the criticism that continues to be out there?
It's the Ontario market is maturing. And, one of the things that we've found in the Ontario market is when a market matures, things like advertising do fall off. And we've seen a decrease in advertising in Ontario, which we predicted. So advertising plays a couple roles. One of the other roles it plays is an awareness for legal entities and regulated operators to perform in. We know that in Ontario, and this has been a topic in your previous shows many times, is the fact that there still is some gray or black market, whatever you want to call it, activity in Ontario with various operators, and marketing and advertising plays a role in pointing the public towards regulated operators. And I think that's a really important part of the role that marketing plays. But we continue to monitor the situation, and the regulatory map in Canada is such right now that the provinces take the lead on this. So we're listening to them very closely as well.
Hey, let's end this podcast on a light note. And John, you admitted you're a St. Louis Blues fan, but I'm going to ask you to pick a winner in the Stanley Cup final.
Oh man, it is a toss-up. You got McDavid, who we partner with, and then we got the Panthers that we need from a sportsbook trading perspective. I'm going to go with the traders. I'm gonna hope for a long, entertaining series that Panthers come out on top.
And Scott, I don't know how strong your Vancouver roots are, but I don't know if there's still a bit of Canucks blood in you. So are you hoping that the Panthers give the Oilers a comeuppance, or would you like to see the Stanley Cup come back to Canada?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of late nights throughout the spring here for me. So yeah, I'm still a die-in-the-wool Canucks fan. So disappointing, but happy to see the Oilers through it. And my prediction is Oilers in 7. I don't think it means anything, but that's currently what I'm going for.
Scott Woodgate is the vice president for BetMGM's Canadian business, and I think Scott's got his fingers in a few other pies with the BetMGM as well. But too many to list at the end of the podcast. John Ewing is the PR manager, Data Insights. Hey, John, thanks so much again. Great to meet you. And let's maybe get you back on the show once we get through the Olympics. And I'd love to have this conversation again around with some of the data you've supplied today.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Yeah. And Scott, thank you so much. And listen, look forward to you and I, grabbing a coffee or at least having a chance to talk on the Metro Toronto Convention Center floor at the Canadian Gaming Summit in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. Always enjoyed listening to the show. It's a wealth of information. You deserve a lot of credit for the conversation you've created around some very important issues in the industry in Ontario and beyond, by the way. I do miss the newsletter, but this podcast is great. So thank you for it.
Thanks, Scott. That reminds me, we will be putting out a special edition of the newsletter next week to tee up the Canadian Gaming Summit. So you can look forward to that, Scott. I'm gonna blow the dust off the keyboard. That's it for this edition of the Gaming News Canada show. Again, thanks to Scott Woodgate and John Ewing for joining us. You can find this podcast at gamingnewscanada.ca and on the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Once again, we try to do these podcasts twice a week. We appreciate everybody who subscribes to the podcast, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.